Okay, all right. So since we're already talking about it,
Oh
do
wait,
you?
we have to intro. If we're doing a nature chat, we have to like start where we start,
Oh
so that I
man,
know where to cut the
is this
video.
is this where we're gonna start though? Talking
Well,
about
no, I'm gonna start and be like, hey, welcome to nature chat, da 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 da, and do the
Or is
thing.
this like you want to have
no.
this
Wait, I want to
discuss
ask
something
about
before we start?
Letterkenny first. I want to ask you if
Oh,
you're
Oh,
you want to
watching
ask
dude,
about
Letterkenny.
Letterkenny?
to a T. Like
Ah,
every person I have ever like what that I know watches that show is like they either it like describes their like them growing up perfectly or they identify as some of the characters in it. It is yeah.
that makes me
Wow.
so happy. That makes me. I was like, so I was talking to one of my American friends who watches it, and he was like, he was talking about this like this trip that he wants to do up through BC, and I was like, man, if you do it and you go through these small towns in BC and
Oh
it's
yeah.
not like Letterkenny, how disappointed? He was like, I would be crushed. So,
So I played hockey growing up, right? And I have like so the hockey guys, me and my buddies, like when we were younger, absolutely. I have friends like farmer friends, same thing. And like I've had some of them I've had to translate the hockey guys talk to back and forth. I had one friend that was legitimately when he was playing junior hockey was legitimately traded for like some pucks and other equipment to another team. Like
okay,
it, yeah.
fabulous. I'm
That's
glad that wasn't on the
amazing.
recording, but that was all I wanted.
Dude, the stereotypes exist for a reason, and it's
I
like anybody in
I
their right mind knows that it's hilarious.
Uh, with that, should we start
So,
recording?
all right. Yeah. Are we already recording, or do you
Yeah,
need to
we
hit
are
the button?
recording, but I just figured you would figure it
all
out
right,
real
start
quick.
with that one then.
I'll cut everything before that.
Yeah.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Nature Chat, the show after the show, where some part of the cast of Nature Check talk about what happened in the show and talk about characters and things. And we have our very first special guest player with us to be the victim today. Yeah, that's right. You and your blank wall background. Um, so we've got Dan Peach with us, who's playing Bedwer. So first off, as always, we do a recap for the Nature Chat. So this past episode of Nature Check was sort of a fresh start because the PCs had just finished a whole bunch of storylines. They're only 5 days into living on Arda, and already so much has happened to them. So they woke up in the morning and were hanging out in the Marked Bird when they found out that there was a gentleman whose livestock had been summarily killed during the night, and they decided to go out to his farm and investigate to see if they could figure out what had killed the livestock and if they could help in any way. As they were investigating, they met an Ibixian or a goat folk, depending on who you are and where you read your D&D monster manuals. And this Ibixian's name is Bedwer, played by Dan. Bedwer was able to provide some local knowledge of wildlife and things that may have contributed to this livestock problem. So the whole group, including Bedwer, went off to investigate a flooded field, which might have been creating nesting habitat for sturges, which are D&D monster mosquitoes. They found the erstwhile farmer working that field being attacked by a group of 6 sturges. The player characters were able to kill most of the sturges. 2 of them flew off, but unfortunately the sturges had also drained the life force of the farmer. And that is the dark curtain on which we close. Sad face. So yeah, how did you guys feel about this episode and the adventure and having an NPC who was actually being played by another human being that wasn't me?
Well, Dan, how did you feel about that? Like,
I thought it was a very very interesting world to become immersed in. Just the lore that you guys have created, the background there. It's sort of interesting to watch more and more of the surface be scratched away and find the things that lie underneath the native races like the Abaxians in this area, as well as some of the local wildlife that
Mhm.
I've not been exposed to before, and the ecological interactions with them.
So obviously, well, I guess I should ask if you watched any episodes of Nature Tech before.
I've listened to them.
Okay, all
I
right.
have been, yeah, I've been your. I think in one of your earlier podcasts, you made a comment about a bunch of random viewers and downloads from Canada, and I'm pretty
Haha.
sure that was myself and my lab mates that were.
Yes, yes.
So I don't always get to listen to them right away, but even with the delay, they're things I listen to transit
Fan-
in the morning, and yeah.
Fantastic. So so when you were putting yourself into this role, are you a goat person in real life?
He starts unzipping his face.
Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of bad puns that I could start going with here, but no, a funny story. I did use way back in the day. I played in a death metal band, and I had a pretty big goatee. My dad is a farmer, and he had goats that had babies, and he tricked me into going over and taking pictures with all of these kids to put up on the internet, and then ask if I was the father. It was a very elaborate and yeah.
Your dad sounds very awesome.
Everybody else but me thought it was very fun.
Okay, so you're not IRL a goat person, but
no, I'm not a goatman.
You do have personal knowledge about blood drinking in arthropods.
I do. So I did my PhD on mosquitoes. I've fed more than 250,000 of them. Even several personally, sticking my arm in the cage. I believe it's somewhere north of 20 liters of my blood that has gone into maintaining them. So many people know that it's just the female mosquitoes that bite, but there are 3,500 species of mosquitoes in the world. Not all of the females take blood. In those that do, not all of them feed on vertebrates. Not all of them feed on mammals even, and those that do feed on mammals, not all of them feed on humans. In those that do take blood, it's only the females, and they do so not as a source of food or a source of energy necessarily, although some can do that. They're generally going for the nutrition and the proteins in it to develop their eggs. So if you want to keep a colony of mosquitoes going, you need to provide them with a source of blood to have the females lay eggs and keep your insects coming.
So even though you are not yet a father, or if you even intend to become a father, you've already participated in the reproductive process, is what you're saying.
Absolutely, and these lazy gits, not a single thing for Father's Day, not a one.
Wow.
I tell them to do stuff, they don't listen. It's yeah.
So all right, so because you're the first mosquito researcher or scientist that we've had on, I do want to kind of double hit this. So when you say you personally fed them, I've always heard this is a thing in the labs that do study mosquitoes. As an agricultural scientist, this is not something I've experienced personally, but it is the responsibility of the scientist to personally feed their blood to the mosquitoes by sticking their
It totally
arm.
depends on a case-by-case basis. You can get, for instance, lamb's blood or sheep's blood. You can get animal blood to feed them in an artificial feeding device, but it tends to, it's expensive, right? You gotta pay for it. You can also have, if you're go through all the red tape with animal care, you can get a restrained guinea pig or a chicken, depending on the mosquito species that you're working with, and have them take blood from that. But for us, it was just with the budget and all of the red tape and stuff. It was just the quickest and cheapest and easiest way to do it. You have to be very careful to make sure that somebody goes and takes a vacation down somewhere that might have a tropical disease, that they don't come back and feed anything right away. And you also make sure that any given cage of mosquitoes is only fed by one person. So when a pathogen is spread by a mosquito, they feed on somebody that has that pathogen. The pathogen then gets into the mosquito and replicates, and then the next person that mosquito bites, they deliver some of that pathogen to them. But if you have mosquitoes that you've reared from the larval stage, they should be completely pathogen-free. So for me to start a cage, take some mosquito larvae, rear them to adult, feed them, that's great. If my supervisor takes a turn, he takes some larvae and raises them and does the same thing himself. It's not sticking arms in cages fed by each other, because that's how bad things happen. I do want to, our lab also, or my previous lab also did a lot of work with bed bugs, and the technician who was my supervisor's wife, her name is Regina Gries, currently holds the Guinness Book of World Records record for number of bed bugs fed. At the time they did that, I think she fed more than a third of a million bed bugs on herself for that research, and it's probably about 100,000 more than that by now.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
So as bad as there are people that have it worse than I do.
I just want to point out how great it is that the animal care protocol takes better care of guinea pigs than it does of the human researchers working with these animals.
So it depends. It totally depends. Yeah, it totally depends on the ethics board of the institution you're at. So for instance, some places, and this is the university I did mine at, if I were to feed these mosquitoes my blood, I couldn't do experiments on the mosquitoes that I'd fed. Um, it's if you're experimenting on the organism or on the that has consumed the human fluid, or on the fluid itself, you can't do that. But because it's the offspring of those that we then experiment on, it's just enough to. They said, yeah, go for it. Plus the fact that it's my research and I'm voluntarily doing it myself and informed consent. I know exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I guess I felt like there was a joke in there about undergrads and guinea pigs and who gets treated better.
Yeah,
or grad students and guinea pigs and who gets treated better. Yeah. I feel like, it's important for us to talk about this, like you said very briefly, why you're feeding them blood, though, right? Because I think that there might be a slight misconception that people think that they're drinking the blood in order to be alive, but that's not true. So what is it about the development of their eggs that requires this blood meal?
Well, so the primary and ubiquitous food of adult mosquitoes is plant sugar, primarily in the form of floral nectar, but that's mostly just for carbohydrates, right? They're not usually getting a ton else from that. You can get some amino acids and a few other things in there, but it's the nutrients from your bloods, the protein. I believe it's isoleucine is the limiting amino acid that is really important for them to get, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there that they need to develop these eggs. And I should say they often can develop eggs if you feed them other things. As long as they've developed they've eaten enough in the larval stage. So there are some species of mosquitoes that are what we call autogenous, and that can lay eggs without consuming anything as an adult, just based on what they've eaten in the larval stage. They can digest their own wing muscles and use that to develop their eggs. But getting a blood meal for a mosquito is a super big payoff. So if some of these species, like the yellow fever mosquito, if she gets a big blood meal from you, she can lay 100, 200 eggs, right? It's a big deal, as opposed to if she were to digest her own musculature to develop or to develop her eggs and then lay them, it would be much, much less than that, in the single digits or low double digits kind of thing. So there's a really big evolutionary incentive to go and get blood if they can. It's a huge payoff. There's a lot of mortality associated with it, swatting, slowing them down and making them more vulnerable to dragonflies and other predators. But it's a big deal if they can get it.
That's wild. I had no idea that it increased their fecundity or their fitness that much to take that single blood meal.
Absolutely, it's a pretty huge deal for them, and it's depending on there are a couple different hypotheses as to how hematophagy developed in mosquitoes, and blood feeding developed in mosquitoes, and one of them, anyways, is that it came from nectar feeding, and it just was such a huge payoff that it was reinforced very strongly, very quickly, and took off from there.
It's interesting because I've heard that blood is a very hard to digest food item. That it surprises me that they were able to quickly adapt, or I mean, maybe they weren't, but
yeah, evolutionarily quickly.
Yeah, right.
I should put some quotation marks around that.
Sure. Just that's an interesting switch. But yeah.
I mean, so there are I briefly mentioned amino acids in nectar previously, and there are species that if you were to feed some nectar with amino acids, and it can use that to develop eggs. One of the competing hypotheses to the blood feeding developing from nectar feeding is that they would feed on the hemolymph of other insects, and that transitioned from there to blood feeding. And that the support for that is in very rare instances in laboratory settings, you can get mosquitoes to feed on insects, to feed on insect hemolymph, and it's a bit, you kind of have to set it up in a very artificial setting, but it does work, and they can develop eggs from that. There are also the what's thought to be the ancestor of mosquitoes back 200 million years ago or so are thought to have been were thought to be mandibles, and they're thought to be predaceous upon other insects.
So you mentioned during the episode we talked about the leech feeding or the annelid, the worm feeding mosquitoes, those are feeding on non-vertebrate fluids.
Correct.
So
Correct.
are those ancestral? Like, are those
No.
those are not considered primitive? Okay.
No, they're my recollection, if I'm remembering the species right, is Urantania sapphirina, which is it's a Urantania species in any case. And if I'm remembering my phylogeny correctly, they're pretty derived.
Huh.
The most ancestral living mosquitoes we have are in the genus Anopheles, which are those that spread malaria. They also, if you look at them under a microscope, they're quite interesting in that so the proboscis, the pointy bit from a mosquito that feeds on you, but beside that are palps. And male mosquitoes, the ones which only feed on plant sugar and floral nectar, the palps are just as long as the proboscis in most species, if not longer. Whereas for most females, they're very short, they're very reduced. But these ancestral Anopheles mosquitoes, in their females, the palps are as long as the proboscis as well. So the significance of that is still under exploration, but
Yeah, let's talk more about their mouth parts because you talked about mandibles just now and what what the ancestor might have looked like, and now we're talking about palps versus proboscis. So can you sort of run down for our viewers and listeners how the multiple mouth parts on a mosquito work?
Sure. So the part of a mosquito that feeds on you is the proboscis, which refers to the entire structure. You have the labium and labella, which is sort of the sheath, and then inside that you have the labrum and the mandibles and maxillae. And so basically, what happens is when a mosquito lands on you, the proboscis will fold back, and the labrum and all the other parts, which are collectively often referred to as a stylet, will pierce into your skin just like a hypodermic needle. And you'll get some of the tip of the maxillae will often have little teeth sort of things on the end of them, and they'll search around looking for capillaries under your skin. Little bit of cutting action there with the teeth, and then she will suck your blood.
So when you
just like a vampire, just in time for Halloween.
So when you say teeth, you mean like a saw blade, right? Like
sorry, yeah, not no, like yeah, not bone, not but
ooh, mosquitoes with teeth is scary.
I had just before my PhD defense, one of the fellows on my committee, I guess he came across a Yahoo Answers question asking how many teeth mosquitoes had, and he emailed that to me and said, "I expect you to know this for your defense." And I'm sitting there, of course, in panic mode, like, "What the hell, man?" And in retrospect, it's like, okay, if he thought you were in trouble, he wouldn't be trying to mess with you right before your PhD defense. But,
So this is something. So okay, so this is definitely a tangent, but so when mosquitoes feed on people, it's referred to as a bite, right?
Yes.
But I work with stink bugs and related species who also have a piercing mouth part, right? So and usually they're feeding on plants, but there are some that are predatory. And for some reason, to me, referring to something feeding with a piercing mouthpart as a bite seems wrong to me.
Yeah.
Even though you use it for mosquitoes, so like when
I hear you, man.
Yeah. Do you have a take on that? You just call it a bite?
No, that's not a hill I'm gonna die on forever. Whatever the consensus is, I'm happy to go with that one.
Relying on your professional expertise to settle this. Yeah. Okay.
There was a paper I read just a while ago, interestingly, with I think it was Western conifer seed bugs. There was a record of one landing on a lady and blood feeding on her, and she described it as quite painful and left her with a very, very big welt. But yeah, I'm bite versus whatever else. I'm not.
That's a thing in the Midwest too, with the minute pirate bugs that come out on the goldenrod. I feel like Jody Green, who's going to be one of our guests when we play in St. Louis, she was posting about it last year on Twitter that like a lot of people call her office and ask about these minute pirate bugs because apparently if you stick your hand or your face in the flowers where they're all hanging out, that they'll bite you. I have goldenrod in my yard and saw the pirate bugs on it, but I haven't been bitten yet. So
one of the main thrusts of my thesis, and we have this in an article we published in Scientific Reports earlier this year. We were looking at the actual chemical compounds emitted from flowers. or in the case of things like goldenrod or the flower we worked with, common tansy, composite flowers that attracted mosquitoes. And we found that quite a few of those compounds were actually shared with humans. So that could be what's going on with I mean, this is pure speculation, but with these pirate bugs, right? If they're feeding on this flower and they're picking up on some of the small acids and other compounds that are often present on your skin, or being emitted by microbes that are present on your skin, it might be very easy to get confused. Hey, this thing that I'm on smells like my food. Why not try biting it?
That's wild.
So.
Yeah, I've been.
If you ever have a flower like goldenrod or something and you smell it and you get sort of a stinky cheese or a cheesy kind of smell from it, or a stinky foot smell, that's some of those compounds at least are shared with people, or by microbes associated with us.
So what you're saying is I can tell people that my feet smell like flowers.
Yes. And on the stinky foot angle, there was a group that did some research in the mid to late 90s that actually won an Ig Nobel Prize for their work, finding that Limburger cheese is attractive to Anopheles mosquitoes, the ones that transmit malaria, preferentially bite you around the feet and ankles. And they found that they were attracted to the odors coming from Limburger cheese, and they thought it was because the microbes present on this cheese were very closely related to those on your feet.
Delightful.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. Are you hungry?
Mm-hmm.
Peter and his whole mozzarella earlier.
That was before we started recording. I thought this was a safe space.
Oh, you did you?
I did.
We're on the internet, man.
How did me?
Nothing is safe ever.
Nothing is safe.
No.
We are all simultaneously just every bad thing about humanity to everybody else right now.
It's true. The three of us represent all of humanity's ills.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a lot of responsibility.
I know, right?
So I want to know how you started studying mosquitoes. So you said you got your PhD studying mosquitoes. What did you do? Did you do like a master's or something before that? How did you wind up in that lab doing that project? What sort of angle drove you to this research? And
sure,
why did you stay with mosquitoes after your PhD?
So,
yeah.
Origin story time.
Yeah.
So I did my bachelor in environmental science at Simon Fraser University here in BC. And during that, I did a lot of cooperative education. So it's sort of in the summer, they get you a paid position and somewhere related to your degree. And one of the jobs that I had was working with the sort of Canadian equivalent of the USDA. So it was called Agriculture Canada. It's now Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And working with crop insects, actually, pests of crops. So working with cranberry pests specifically, there's a little midge that gets in the tip of cranberries called cranberry tipworm, and we were looking at that and trying to identify its pheromone. But we partnered with the lab that would eventually be my grad school lab, and that's how I got exposed to them. So I did that for a few semesters. I then decided to change gears and work in environmental consulting for a while. That's how I got exposed to doing things like paid whale watching trips and neat stuff like that. But I decided to go back to grad school, and when I did, I thought, well, this lab that I worked with for this chemical ecology stuff, I just really liked everything about them. The supervisor's a fantastic guy, super supportive of his students. They're reasonably well funded. It sort of ticked every box, and it was like, well, and I can also stay in my neck of the woods and have some help from family and stuff to get through it. So I started off in the master's program there. I started in the master's in pest management program. The mosquitoes were assigned to me as a study organism, a study project. We were looking at these floral compounds that attract mosquitoes with the intention of turning them into a mosquito bait or using them in conjunction with some products that are already out there and that mimic human scents to attract mosquitoes. So when mosquitoes are very, very young, young adults, so when they've been an adult for just a couple days, the females don't really, they're not as attracted to human odors and human cues as they are to flower cues. So if you give them a choice when they're super young into the adult phase, they'll generally prefer floral odors or floral cues over those of vertebrates. So we thought, well, great. If we can come up with something that attracts these younger mosquitoes, like we can either use it on its own or combine it with some human odors to improve these things. So that's how I got started on mosquitoes. And I was a little apprehensive at first, especially when I was told I had to feed them. Although to be fair, my supervisor said that he was perfectly okay doing it if I didn't want to. But I thought, well, if I'm in this to win it, I better at least be exposed to my study organism. Some people have to eat your study organism, so I figured I should let the study organism eat me. And, it was definitely not fun at the start. Sticking your arm into a cage full of mosquitoes. I mean, your natural reaction is, of course, to swat them, right? It's almost like just a muscle memory thing. So the first time I did this, I still remember it clear as day, just looking through this mesh on my arm, and like I could see my arm shaking, I could feel myself sweating, and it felt like I had hundreds of mosquitoes on me. It felt like I could feel every single individual bite. Oh man, what am I doing? If I'm going to be doing this for the next few years, this is just, okay, well, I'll give this a try for a little while and see how it goes. And yeah, the first few times I did it, I couldn't sleep at night. It was so itchy. Everything in the book at once wasn't enough to get rid of it. But I was sort of told that, well, if I keep doing it, I'm either going to develop an allergic reaction or an immunity to it. And luckily, immunity, quote unquote. But luckily, it just, my body reacted less and less of the time.
I was about to ask you what your tips were for mosquito bite, relief, I guess. But apparently you don't have any, except just keep doing it.
Yeah, my wife hates to go hiking with me. This is just purely anecdotal, but it seems like it just out in the woods or whatever, that they don't come to me as much as they used to. So I'm almost wondering if my body's just adapted and changed my skin chemistry somehow to make myself less attractive to them. There are and there are companies with patents on this sort of stuff, that there are compounds that your body will naturally produce that are repellent or at least less attractive to mosquitoes. But I don't know if anybody's looked into whether that changes based on how much biting pressure you've had. So I'd sort of suspect that maybe that's the case. And now my wife hates to go into the woods with me in mosquito season because they all go to her and leave me alone for the most part.
That's amazing. I know, just again, anecdotally, my husband is the person who mosquitoes are always very attracted to. And we've heard a lot about the idea that like different blood types are more or less attractive to mosquitoes. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, and I should say that there is there's conflicting literature out there on a lot of it. So this is just sort of my personal take on what's out there. There's no entirely agreed upon set of facts, but blood types absolutely can have an effect on it, and it all comes down to your skin chemistry. So when a mosquito is attracted to a person, they're picking up on the carbon dioxide in your breath, they're picking up on volatile organic compounds that come off of your body, they're picking up on ammonia, heat, moisture, and visual cues. So dark clothing, they'll be more attracted to light clothing, and also movement. But some people, depending on your blood type, it's thought to have an effect on what compounds come off of your skin, and that will affect the attraction of mosquitoes. So when a mosquito is coming to you, it doesn't smell the blood. It's what contains the blood. It's not the what's in the present. It's the packaging that does the trick. And yeah, the different blood types will have different skin chemistries associated with them. So my recollection, anyways, is that the O's are the most attractive, and as for the A's and B's, I can't remember which comes where in that hierarchy. Yeah.
Okay, so well then, Cheryl, maybe you'll allow us a little peek behind the curtain. Are the different species in D&D, are they differently attractive to sturges? Are half elf blood? Is it more?
I didn't. There's nothing in the Sturge entry as written about that, and I didn't really do a whole lot of working on developing them within the ecology to be like, oh, they preferentially da 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 da, because they're not mosquito equivalent. But there is a monster that I am planning on allowing to be incorporated into the game at some point that does preferentially attack a certain playable race. I used it in a previous campaign, and the player who was playing that race was very upset. And I was like, "What do you want from me, man? Like that's just how it was written in the monster manual." They don't really provide a whole lot of context as to why that particular monster hates or preferentially attacks that particular race, but I think it's really interesting, and maybe it all comes down to chemistry. Yeah, so I don't know if sturges have preferences, but there are some monster manual monsters that do.
I could certainly see preferences between kobolds or dragons or.
Oh, this is even just a difference between like elf versus human versus dwarf.
Oh.
So yeah.
Interesting. Interesting.
Well, all that ale that the dwarves drink, that should make them more attractive to sturges if they're based on mosquitoes. So that.
I have heard that alcoholic beverage consumption can increase attractiveness. Yeah.
The mechanics of why is a sort of a question mark still. But I remember the first. God, I wish I could remember who this was by, but I remember reading a study, one of my first weeks in grad school, where it was like a supervisor in his lab went out to the field to do a study on whether or not drinking would be making more or less attractive to mosquitoes, and like it was basically like the supervisor was the one control while all of the students just consumed copious amounts of alcohol.
Okay, I love it, but also like, how do you get that public?
I don't know, and
There's no way.
For all I remember, it could have been some like BS journal, but I just remember coming across it and thinking like, oh man, this is fantastic.
It's great because it's like, if it was published in 2003, I would have been like, oh yeah, that's a terrible journal article. But if it was published in like 1927, I'd have been like, no, this is pretty standard like scientific literature for that decade.
Reading old papers. Oh my god.
I've cited things from the 1700s where it's like, some Italian monk goes for a picnic with his attendants and is talking about he sees mosquitoes on this type of flower or that type of flower, and the mosquitoes are flying around his bottle of wine. Yeah, it's really the stuff that was written when like printing was just becoming a thing in the English language, where you have the S and the F, right? They'd use the S would have like a line through the middle of it, like talking about how mosquitoes are sucking on all sorts of things, but it looks like an F the entire time. Yeah.
Not dull research reading then.
No. My inner 14-year-old's definitely like.
Speaking of inner 14-year-old, so not only were you our, yeah, I know, right? Good transition. Not only were you our first guest player, but you volunteered yourself for this torture. So let's talk a little bit about your experience with D&D and why you wanted to come be a part of this crazy, weird, non-functioning project we've got going on here.
After you got to the end of that was a really good segue.
Thank you.
I think if I remember right, one of my friends came across you on Twitter, and I saw something he put up, and we got in touch across there, and it was just my experience with D&D goes like back quite a ways. When I was really little, I collected hockey cards, of course, and from there,
Canadian sentence I've ever
heard. Anyways, long story short, the store I went to buy hockey cards from had, I think it was Magic cards, and then from those, I think that store closed down, and I went to a different store to get those, and they had Dungeons and Dragons, and then I made the transition into that, and I probably would have been at 11 or 12 years old or so. Played it a bunch growing up, and then connecting it to science. A bunch of people in the lab at one of the Entomological Society of Canada meetings said, "Hey, would you guys be interested in playing this?" I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely." So of course they have the big gala dinner, and everybody has a ton to drink, and got like 13 people back to the hotel room, and had just like this big, one of the messiest D&D sessions you can ever imagine. But it was such a hot mess, it kind of went full circle. It became glorious because of that. So we had a session that night. Then the next day was, I think, the last day of the conference, and we had a bunch of alcoholic beverages left over. So it was okay. Well, let's try and consume these. We were late for some function, so I just remember people like Smirnoff Caesars, like a Bloody Mary in a bottle, like at room temperature, and people were just chugging this to try and drink it all in time to finish it while we're playing this game until we went to whatever session we got to. And so trying to bring it into folks like that, and then some of these, one of these folks was who heard of you guys and got in touch through there, and several of them follow you and listen to it. like not always right on time, but download it and listen to it on transit or while they're looking through a microscope or doing some data entry.
That's the joy of podcasts.
Well, yeah, right? Podcasts are great for lab work and data entry. Well, hey, thanks, Canadian scientists, for listening to our podcast.
Hey, you've got a niche market, so.
Yes.
Well, we love all y'all.
Isn't it a thing where it's like if somebody's making in the States, if somebody's like got a fake boyfriend or girlfriend, they say it's their like girlfriend in Canada or whatever.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So now when people say you have an audience,
have an audience
in
in
Canada,
Canada.
nobody's gonna.
Oh, it hurts so bad.
Oh, that's so good.
Oh, it hurts so bad. I know there are well, actually I didn't confirm it with them, but I have some friends from Canada.
Oh well, maybe they're listening on her too.
They make podcasts too, and so they're probably listening.
Oh, right on.
Oh man. So you started playing D&D when you were fairly young. Did you have like a pretty set group that you played with, or was this sort of like a bunch of random one-shots throughout?
Oh God, when I was really young, it was mostly just this like group at the local game store we go down to and play it every, I don't even know what day of the week, but there was a set night we'd go down and play, and that lasted for maybe a year or so. And then I ran into some folks down there. I was like, hey, I recognize you from my school, and became buddies with them. And yeah, I've been playing with those guys off and on for close to 20 years now. All through high school, one of them lived next to the school, so we'd go down there and try and get someone's older brother to go buy us some beer and just hang out and play D&D every Friday or every other Friday kind of thing.
D&D and drinking.
Yep.
That's marvelous.
That's glorious. I love it.
Yeah. There's a lot worse trouble you can get into than that, I figure. So.
Yeah. And without giving away spoilers, because we haven't explored the whole storyline yet, but I'd love to hear, I mean, I have heard some of it already, but if you could share with Peter and with our audience in Canada, your process behind, like, building Bedware. Mm-hmm. I think we'd love to hear more about, like, your thought process behind building that character.
Sure. Well, I mean, the race of an Abaxian that came from yourself as a suggestion, but the backstory to it, I think part of the inspiration from it came from one of your first episodes where you guys were talking about colonization, and I thought like that's really interesting. But I was also listening to a podcast about the history of Ireland at the time. Now Ireland was colonized. I thought, okay, well, like that's not when you do that usually, like when colonization comes up, that's not usually the vein that it goes to. But I thought, oh, well, that might be really neat to take that and draw on it for inspiration here. And so thinking about it, and then like, okay, the Celtic tribes and stuff, all the tattoos and the woad and stuff that they have. Well, that could be sort of tied into the body painting to keep biting insects away. And it just sort of went from there. Okay, you get this big hulking goat person barbarian with all these Celtic swirls and stuff on him, and tie it into the biology of the monsters that we're going to be fighting, and we now have fought. I thought it was quite neat, and also a bit of a different take on the colonization aspect, but also on a barbarian, right? Because usually it's a big Conan kind of type person that you think, but there's different types of barbarians, right?
Very much so. I love that. And yeah, he asked me, he was like, so how about Gaelic? And I was like, great. And then I was like, oh crap, that means I have to learn how to pronounce a whole bunch of like Gaelic names.
I had a lot of trouble trying to come up with an accent that I felt I could consistently keep, because every time I would try to do like a really highty-tighty, like kind of that sort of thing, I was just like, it just goes into Australian for me. So like like
I feel you as someone who still can't keep their character voice straight.
Your character voice isn't even that different from your voice, man.
I know. I feel like it started off as being more so, and it's just gradually regressed back to my regular voice. And I didn't even try it right.
As long as your regular voice doesn't start slipping into your character voice when you're not paying attention.
My biggest voice problem right now, this is stupid, but Leon is supposed to have a German accent. I speak German, but I like can never do a German person speaking English. That accent is very hard for me for some reason.
Yeah. the supervisor whose lab I was in and his wife that feeds the bed bugs, they're from Germany, so we get exposed to that a lot. And I feel kind of bad. I have to look over my shoulder every time I do it because I'm like, don't want to be disrespectful.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, no, I loved all of the, like you said, all those like neat details that just sort of clicked. It sounds like you sort of had galaxy brain while you were making this character. But yeah, it wound up being like it fits really nicely with the story, and I was so appreciative because doing these guest spots, I didn't want to be like too restrictive and be like, this is what you're doing and this is how you're doing it, but also like you can't just give me random stuff because I have to, you know. So yeah, no, I thought this was really fun and great, and I loved it, and now I want everyone to volunteer to come be a guest player on the show. So
Oh, thanks. I kind of feel that the best thing someone can do as a guest is to make just lots of ammunition and possible hooks and stuff to be used for or not in the future, but just to have these sort of possibilities pop up, and the DM can pick and choose as they go, right? Because it's ultimately a creative and improvisation exercise, and just creating that sort of fuel is what keeps it going.
Absolutely. And go for it.
I'll say just as a character, I mean I find it insanely intimidating as far as a road to walk, because like I have so, I mean, like as somebody who is only, like the most privileged category of people that you can possibly be, I'm trying to do my best as a human being to, address colonialism and all of these other, things that we touch on with this topic, and then doing that and trying to be respectful of these issues, and then through the lens of a character who is not that, is not has basically the exact same privileges that I do, but is less aware than I am, which is still not that aware. It's a very difficult a thing to do, and I'm sure I'm could do it infinitely better, but it's it's definitely something that I don't know, I'm really struggling with, and I don't know, it's continuing to challenge me as a person dealing with these topics. Which
I'm glad we have it though. Like, yeah, the metaphor of Cedric hits you in the face, which so it's not subtle, but like I think it's really valuable to have.
Yeah.
So no, I like that it's there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think part of the when you do something like this, it's like with art and with acting, right? It's sometimes like, even though you're not the character, you just have to put yourself in the character's shoes, and in a respectful way, but like do your best to sort of think of things from that perspective, and act with other people who are putting on these character masks to make an interesting story, and to bring these things to light and to explore them, right? Like it's the art aspect of it, if you will.
Have you ever run a game yourself, or are you?
Oh yes.
Always,
yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. We that's why I appreciate the DM angle, and letting people run free with stuff, but also not wanting to just throw a bunch of random stuff at you and having to be like, how do I do anything with this? No, we the group of friends that I've been playing with for a long time, we often take turns DMing, and I've actually started a group up recently with my wife and a couple of her girlfriends from high school, and another couple that we're good friends with, all of whom are listening to this. So hi guys.
Oh hi.
We have a group with them that we started, and I DM'd that, but some of them have actually started DMing other groups outside of that, which is fantastic. And I think it's really, really great to have experience from both sides of the fence, and it makes you better as a player and as a DM to sort of know each side of that, right? It gives you that experience. So, okay, here's sort of the dynamic that's going on. Here's how I can build on what this person just did, but still stay in a way that like is a two-way street and everybody interacts with. You know? At least that's my experience with it.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. And Cheryl and I have had the same. I've DM'd too, and so Cheryl and I have had those same conversations where it's very much like, oh, it's interesting how much it forces you to think more critically as a player. Once you are, you more proactively, actively co-telling a story.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the most memorable memories that I have from D&D, whether on either side of that, are things that nobody intended to be a large plot thing at the start of it, right? Little details that one person threw out there, and the other side was like, oh, hey, that's kind of neat, so we'll throw out this other thing to build on there, and it just goes like that, right? Like, and some of these things are just, yeah, they become incredibly important plot hooks or inside jokes that last for years off the cuff little comments or little added bits of detail that, if they hadn't become something big, would have added more flavor to the story but done nothing else, but that you can take and roll with that and pick up and go with. I had a friend once that, like, okay, great, we had I think this was when I was DMing, but he killed a necromancer or some sort of sentient undead, and the character nailed the head to his shield just as an ornament. Well, this thing's undead, that head's still going to be alive, so let's see how that goes. And it became this like 3-year campaign kind of thing, or like there was another one where somebody paid for something with coins, and they just happened to say, like, yeah, these ancient coins that, like, none of us recognize or whatever, like, these put out, and it's, oh, okay, great. So if, like, half the players speculate where those coins from, and then just like, yeah, what he said is totally what I was planning all along. That's right.
That's amazing. I totally agree, though. Yeah, like, random things just become so important, and I guess that's why when people talk about, I feel like Travis on Critical Role is my favorite example for this. Like, he hates shopping episodes. And I feel like a lot of people hate shopping episodes, but there's also something to be said for a geek like me who likes world building above all other things. Like, every single shopkeeper in Arda or in New Seychester has, like, a name and a race and a family and, like, a personality, or, like, as Cedric found out in his first shopping experience, like, they all have religious affiliations. And, like, I think it's really fun to roleplay the people in the world, because you never know what sort of weird thing could come out of, like, role-playing with a random shopkeeper. Yeah, so I people the world fully because I want those things to happen.
And I'm sure that takes a lot of time and effort, right? But
absolutely,
it adds an extra layer to it that, you know.
Well, and it worked, because in the last campaign that I ran, one of my player characters, like, the first interaction they had with a particular shopkeeper, he developed a crush on her. And so she went from being some, like, random NPC with, like, a few details scribbled down on a note card to be like, oh, I have to think of her favorite, like, what's her favorite restaurant? What's her favorite color? How does she feel about musical performances? Because now he's taking her on dates, and I'm like, you gotta be kidding me, man. But it was amazing.
Was there some, like, awkward role playing where you had to pretend to be this character that had the...
It was super awkward because the player was my friend's husband, and meanwhile my husband was also a player. That it was really great.
My wife does that to me all the time. Yeah, you're like, you're making this really weird, honey. Like...
Yep. Yeah, but I can't tell you anything more about that shopkeeper character because she's also in New Seychester.
Oh.
Yeah.
So this is, I like this because I love those kinds of tangents, and as like, my personality is, if I'm gonna play D&D, like, those are the kinds of things that I go off on. But I do think, like, as with the point of this podcast, we're also trying to, like, do specific things and hit specific notes, and also it can be a little bit exclusionary for the other players. Like, you're like, oh, like, me and the DM are gonna do this thing for, like, 45 minutes, and you guys are just gonna sit there and be like, okay, like, it's cute, but, go on. It's interesting trying to do D&D performatively. You run into a little bit of, like, I don't know. And I was thinking about that tonight specifically because, like, when Cedric comes down, there's this, kind of debate going on at the bar.
The rats.
It's like, it's a very obvious plot hook, right? And I Dan, like, but, like, I know, like, obviously I know tonight we have a guest player. We need to incorporate you. Like, this is happening, and I was like, man, I kind of wish Cheryl had at least given me, like, a hint of, like, okay, so yes, you need to follow up on this very obvious plot hook so that we can, like, do this thing, because it was like, which never would I ever want in a real in like a non-performative D&D game, but it was like, man, I kind of need a little bit of railroading here, like
Yeah.
to make this happen.
I realized that was happening. I was like, well, I want this conversation between these two guys because I want you to hear what both of them have to say. And then when you reacted, and I was like, oh, I realized that I hadn't given you enough information to be like, oh, so the storyline that includes Dan is the one with the farm animals.
Right. Yeah, it's like,
P.S.
hope he's not a parrot merchant or whatever the fuck.
When I was sitting there, I was like, rats. Like, we didn't talk about any bloody rats. What's going on
No,
here?
we didn't. We did not talk about rats. That is its own thing. But that's another thing, right? Like, it also makes the world more believable because it wasn't just this guy. Like, it would have been a painfully obvious adventure hook if it was just the guy complaining to the bartender and then complaining to you about his farm animals, right? The fact that there was someone else who has his own story, like that makes it more three-dimensional. And yeah, sure, you can follow up on the rats later if you decide you want to, but like, you know, it makes the world a little more real.
Yeah,
and also because because the guy talking about the rats is a person in the world that Nancy's character knows. So yeah, like, you know, I'm constantly trying to bring in all of that kind of stuff too, because she lives there, so it has to be three-dimensional for her especially. Yeah.
Like it, you know, they're with regards to railroading, like it's a thing that it's a tool, right? You use it in the right amount, in the right time, in the right place. Too much or too little of it can be a detriment. Even in our real lives, like there's a bit of quote unquote railroading. We know we have certain deadlines that we have to meet for certain things or certain obligations or certain things that we're going to be exposed to. But you know, how we get from point A to B is often a bit more murky, and incorporating a bit of that into this fantasy game, especially when done so judiciously and properly timed, there's nothing wrong with it, and it often adds to the adventure.
Well,
do you think there's go for it.
I was just gonna say I like that because I like, you know, and you guys were talking about how much you enjoy like these like random, you know, throwaway jokes or you know, incidences that end up being important later on. And I feel like it's funny because from a certain perspective there are so many things in life like that. Like how many people met their spouse because of some like random situation at some party, or some guy said this thing, or you know, like I feel like there's so many things in your life. Like I am where I am in my life because of so many very random things that only happen because so and so, you know, knew a person who introduced me to another person who had a job opening. You know, I feel like it's a very real, you know, relatable thing for sure.
Absolutely. I met my wife online, even though she lived a block away from me. We did undergrad in the same school, and her high school friends overlapped with mine and my brother's high school friends. And we had no idea either of us existed.
Wow.
So yeah.
That's amazing.
And then she threatened to mace me within 5 or 10 minutes of meeting her. But you know.
I like this woman. She's
her and the bedbug lady. They seem like the winners.
Yeah, sorry I keep bringing her up, but there's a lot of funny stories there.
Well, that's great. I was gonna ask the whole idea of like judicious railroading. Do you think that means there are some like correlates between playing D&D or being the DM of D&D and like mentoring undergrads and grad students in your new position as a postdoc?
Absolutely.
Look at me redirecting. Look at that.
Yeah. Speaking of railroading. No, absolutely. I mean, how I personally learn best is sort of to have people sort of, you know, point me in the right direction and give me the starting tools to make those first couple, you know, connections, and then sort of let me build from there. And you know, everybody has different ways that they learn, but I feel that is a very good way to start undergrads on, because it helps to build confidence right off the bat. The first few experiments that I did on my own, I definitely was nervous about, right? Like, oh, am I, you know, worrying about all these tiny little things that you know aren't as big as you end up learning they are down the road. And sometimes you're so focused on the little things that you miss the big things that you should be paying attention to, and that. But helping people get off on the right foot and building that confidence up from those foundations is a very important way to start, and it's a good way to use railroading in a scientific mentorship kind of context. So, but you know, everybody has different ways that they learn, and you sort of have to read the individual as well. I've certainly met people who who just were like, yeah, just go for it. You know what you're doing already. You're a superstar. If anything, I should be taking notes from you, and I'm worried because I'm gonna have to compete against you for a job down the line here. But and and other all over the map. But, you kind of have to repeat it. And, yeah, and there's times too people get started and you have to correct them and put them back on that railroad. But we all learn in different ways, and we all have our ups and downs. I have threatened to make people be the mosquito feeder if they. It was an empty threat, but it was enough. Yeah. Oh, and Peter, speaking of your comment earlier about how we both have food last names, I had an undergrad who worked with me, and he was a very, very talented fellow. And his last name was Almond. So we had Peach and Almond. We always joked that we were a detective agency here.
Or a yogurt flavor.
Yeah. I think it's droop fruits is the collective term that would include both peaches. Anyways.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. That's all the stone fruits, right? Like.
Yeah. So it's something like that.
Yeah. That sounds true. I don't know. Fruits are so weird. You can never keep track of what's a fruit, what's a berry, and which reproductive tissue is turning into what part of the edible plant. Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Plants are weird.
Yeah, they are. We need to get some plant scientists on here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, speaking of railroading, if I can just loop way back to mosquito biology, because I don't think we ever explained why Bedmer was singing to the.
Oh no, we didn't do that one. Yeah.
And the connection there is that mosquitoes will hear each other. I've heard it very artfully referred to as they sing to each other. And so the antennae of a male mosquito are very, very plumose, and they have and both male and female mosquitoes have these, but in the male it's particularly derived. They have this really derived organism at the bottom, called the Johnson's organism. They're very sensitive to sound at the right frequency, and so a male will hear the of the female, and they'll use that to locate them, and then as they get closer, they'll actually adjust their wing beat frequencies, and if they're impressive to each other,
Wild.
There are other cues involved as well, but that's what the time.
But yeah, Dan brought that up as something that we should incorporate, and I was like, yeah, let's go for it. I'll just make something up because, of course, that's scientists. Well, any person who's an expert in anything will always ruin that thing in movies for their friends. And I feel like scientists are especially bad when it comes to like D&D because we're like, but that's not how that monster would do the thing. When it's like a unicorn or a dragon, and you're like, but dude, it's like so like yes, like we're trying to have fun, but also like the monster manual was not written by biologists, nor should have been, but we can certainly add things if we want. So there isn't anything in the monster manual stat block or entry for Sturges about the wing beats and the singing as a correlate to mosquitoes, but when Dan suggested the singing, I was like, I mean, it's got a will score, right? It's got a will save, so I just rolled will saves based on his performance as the difficulty, and so that's why one of them failed, and it worked out great. I don't think that mechanic is broken at all. I think that was a really cool addition, and it was very a creative use of your knowledge of the organism. So yeah, I love things like that, and I'm certainly gonna keep us open for stuff like that in the future, because why not add some more biology and biological mechanisms into the game?
Absolutely.
The rules exist to be broken, and as long as it adds and increases the amount of fun people are having, why not?
Yeah. Yeah, no, when it happened, I was like, oh no, I know what's happening, and I love this. So into this.
I was given some books from an old mentor of mine who unfortunately passed away last year. But in them, I found a newspaper clipping from, it was like the late 70s or early 80s. It was somewhere in Manitoba, and it was a radio station advertising that at like certain times of the day they were going to play on the radio the wing beat frequency of a certain species for people that were working in the bush, and they were like, hopefully this will repel them, or give you some ease from them. And I thought it was, it obviously didn't take off, or it would be much more prevalent today, but I thought it was a very interesting idea for, especially for an ad campaign too.
Oh man, yeah.
That's hysterical. I love it.
I feel like I've seen things for like sonar, mosquito deterrence or whatever. Is that the mechanism that's supposed to be behind them, or?
My experience with those things is, at least the ones that I've tested, they don't tend to work.
Mm-hmm.
I know there are insects that if they hear, for instance, bat sounds, it'll work as a repellent. I've not tested that with mosquitoes, but some of the sound emitters where they'll emit the frequency of different species don't specifically work. But I mean, there was a paper that just came out, I think in this last year, where they found that I think they played Skrillex very, very loudly, and they found that was able to disrupt mosquito behavior. So there might be something to it, and it just depends, how you do it, or a volume.
Sure. Yeah. Deters
I feel like
mosquitoes
Skrillex might repel some people too.
I think it was in Acta Tropica as the journal, if I'm remembering right. But yeah, I mean, and like they did good science and everything. It's not just some gimmick. They just, okay, well, let's choose this as our source of noise and see.
Oh no, that's. Yeah, I interviewed Dr. Brandon Barton for a video for my YouTube channel, like 2 years ago now. But his research group just in the past year published a paper looking at using AC/DC as like noise pollution and what organism they were interrupting. But yeah, like rock music definitely belongs in science research.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And on the flip side of that, like some of the mosquitoes that specialize in feeding on amphibians, like they're frog specialists, and they'll actually be attracted to the noise of frogs croaking. Whether or not that occurs in species that feed on humans is up for investigation, but there has been speculation to that in papers that the wing beat frequencies in some species are close enough to the sort of average frequency of voices for some people that it's a possibility.
So maybe like bad karaoke singers get bitten more often.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, it was the fundamental frequency was more likely to overlap with infants and with females. Which if you think of people that are less likely to be able to defend themselves, infants are certainly up there, or a mother carrying partner could certainly be distracted.
There's also just like the straight up frequency and the fact that like infant and female voices have higher frequencies in them. Yeah.
And that's all pure speculation. Like nobody's looked into that right now.
We like wild speculation.
That's a discussion before, right?
Yeah.
I would love to see the IRB review proposal to be like, all right, so we're gonna take a bunch of babies and we're gonna put them in cages with mosquitoes.
Any proposal that starts with "so we're gonna take a bunch of babies" is not gonna go.
We're gonna need them to cry, so we're gonna stab them with pins, and yeah. It's understandable why that research hasn't been done and shouldn't ever be done.
Yeah. I'm just picturing like somebody does a very well written, intro and significance, then it's in the methods. So we're gonna take a bunch of babies.
Yeah. Oh god. Yeah.
The person reading the paper is like, I was with you until that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we're not going to fund this research, and also we're putting you on a list.
Oh boy. Do you guys, either of you have any final thoughts? I feel like this has been a good discussion. The time always flies when we do these.
It has flown. Dan, this was great.
Really today the time was about flies. So.
Yeah. Oh man, these mosquito puns are starting to get under my skin.
Yeah. Oh. Okay, I can't handle this. I'm reach my
I just really want to say thanks for having me on here, you guys. It's been a blast. I look forward to the second installment there. And if you guys ever find yourselves up in my neck of the woods up here, please shoot me a line and we'll go grab a beer.
Aw, that's awesome. Well, you've been a great guest. Thank you so much for playing with us and talking to us about your research and stuff. This has been super fun. Don't forget that you can follow Nature Check and all of the lovely people who play it on Twitter and maybe also Instagram, depending on how much time they put into their social medias. And if you are an undergrad in British Columbia, find Dan and his lab online because they're looking for people to work in their lab.
I'll show up my Twitter handle's just @DanPeach3, so drop me a line on there and yeah.
Do all the things. Thanks everybody for hanging out with us and listening to another Nature Chat. These are always so much fun. I love interviewing people because I get to learn about all kinds of weird stuff I never would have known otherwise. And we will see you very soon for the next episode of Nature Check.
Fantastic.
Bye.